Hey, everybody, welcome back to the So We Speak podcast. This is Cole Fakes, and I'm joined by Terry Fakes. We're going to talk some apologetics today. We're doing this loose series on opportunities for the gospel. Last time we talked about the cultural side of things, and I can say from a couple pieces of feedback, texts, and emails and things, that when we were talking about the movement back towards belief in God,
hmm
that people don't like living in a world without meaning. They don't like living in a world where you can explain everything without God. That's just such a dissatisfying way to live. That really resonated not just with the people listening, but with people that they know. I think this is something that we're beginning to experience in
hmm
our world, and I think this will be a major feature of the kind of quote unquote post-Christian world that we find ourselves in. When you think about apologetics, though, it's not just opening the door kind of negatively, people who don't like the worldview they have and they're looking for a different one. Typically, when we think of apologetics, we think of that passage we covered, give a reason for the hope that is in you. And
Right.
so, coupled with some of the cultural apologetics we're doing, what is it in the culture that only makes sense if you understand the way that God made the world, if you understand the biblical witness, if you understand the values of Christianity, there's a positive side too. We actually think that you should believe some things.
hmm
And so, as we talked about it, and especially as we've come into this Lent season, we're a week out from Ash Wednesday, about 6, 7 weeks out from Easter now. The starting point for all Christian apologetics is the resurrection. And so I thought, usually you only hear sermons about the resurrection on Easter Sunday. For whatever reason, we don't talk much about proving the resurrection otherwise. I thought, well, we've had a lot of great conversations about the resurrection and the books
hmm
that we've read and the resources that are out there. Let's take a few minutes and talk about proving the resurrection.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. The resurrection, as you know, I think everybody's familiar with 1 Corinthians 15, and Paul makes this huge claim, which is absolutely true, that if Christ isn't raised from the dead, then our faith is futile. So it is the central claim of Christian. There are a number of important claims, but it's the central, in my view, claim of Christianity is even if, and I don't believe this for a moment, but stay with me, even if, as some people claim, the Bible is full of historical inaccuracies. I don't agree with that, but it's just, even if, no matter what you see in the Bible that you don't agree with, you have to deal with the resurrection.
Hmm.
If only the resurrection was historically accurate in the New Testament, again, I don't believe that, but even so, you have to deal with that reality.
Right. Yeah, I was talking about doubting Thomas in a sermon a couple of weeks ago, and Thomas, of course, is the one that doubts the resurrection. When the disciples are all
hmm
together and Jesus appears, Thomas is not there, and they come and tell him later. They say, "We saw Jesus; he's been raised from the dead." And you remember Thomas says, well, "I'm not going to believe it until I see it. I need to put my hands in the wounds. I need to put my hand in his side. Otherwise, I'm not going to believe it. It's just too good to be true." And of course, Jesus appears to him and shows him. And so he investigates his doubts, which I think is one of the
hmm
pillars of apologetics in this new world we live in is inviting people and giving people the space to investigate their doubts. I think one of the worst things we can do in the church is, for lack of time or lack of interest or lack of education, shut down people who want to ask questions.
hmm
Questions can be difficult. There's things that are hard to explain. But in the end, we actually don't need to be afraid of anybody's doubts because we believe that you can lay the Bible and Christian history down next to anything else
hmm
and work out and show that Christianity is true. It can be difficult. There's a lot of smart people out there who don't believe, but I don't think we need to be threatened by that. And so we want to invite investigation. We want to see the model that Jesus gives us with Thomas as a model of doing good apologetics, inviting somebody to check out their doubts. And so I was talking about this in a sermon, and I was telling this example. There years ago, Ben Williams, who many of you will know from this podcast, from his great articles at So We Speak, and I were on this panel talking about faith and science. And there were kind of two Bible people, two science people. Of course, Ben is both. He's got his undergrad in science, and he's got his PhD now in apologetics. So he's the perfect person to have on that panel. I'm not sure why I got on this panel, but we're in the Q&A portion of this panel, and somebody asks, is there anything in the Bible that can be proven historically? And without skipping a beat, Ben immediately says, the empty tomb. And I thought that was such a good answer because it speaks to several different factors that go into talking about the resurrection. The first one being the resurrection is a historical event. The resurrection is not something that's just spiritual. You've kind of seen this in certain eras in the church. People want to get rid of the miracles in the Bible, back to kind of just the physical things that happen. The journalists' approach to Jesus and the Gospels.
Hmm.
Well, the problem with doing that is the resurrection is both miraculous. Obviously, people don't rise from the dead, but it's also a fact of history. It was done in the physical, real, historical world. The early Christians were not proclaiming Jesus is spiritually risen from the dead off in heaven. What they were proclaiming, like Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, Jesus is risen from the dead. People have seen him. If you want to talk about it, you can ask people about it because he did it in real time in history. And
Hmm.
so at the center of the Christian faith, you have a spiritual truth, but you also have a historical truth. You have something that God did in history that you can investigate. And whether or not you believe that Jesus rose from the dead, maybe the most verifiable fact in all of history is that the tomb was empty.
Hmm.
So you can argue about why you think the tomb was empty, but I don't know anyone who would argue that the tomb was not empty. That seems to me to be about as historically certain as anything that's ever happened in history.
I agree with that. And I think that's the central thing that has to be dealt with. And it turns out that the evidence for that is very strong, that that tomb was empty. And there are a lot of objections to it. But I think Gary Habermas does a good job of say, let's start with what everyone agrees with. In other words, are there a certain set of facts that whether you believe in the resurrection or you don't, you might believe in these certain set of facts? And then where would those take us?
Yeah, I like this approach. I like this argument. I can think back, it might have been when I was in high school. We went to this conference, this apologetics conference together, and heard Gary Habermas for the first
Hmm.
time. And what I love about his approach is he doesn't actually start by proving the resurrection. He starts by gathering evidence that every historian, every biblical scholar, not just conservatives, not just evangelicals, but really any historian, student of the Near
Hmm.
East, is going to admit is true. And then he's going to show the easiest explanation for all these facts that we all agree on is that Jesus rose from the dead. And
Right.
so I would say this is a great way to think about this as a Christian is how can we find, going back to our last episode, how can we find common ground without ceding anything in terms of our own holiness or commitment to Christ, but how can we find common ground with somebody who doesn't believe so that we can have a real conversation that
Hmm.
might open the door for them to see Jesus in a new light? And so this minimal facts argument is a brilliant way of talking about it. You start with the fact of the empty tomb. Nobody disputes that the tomb was empty. It's well attested in history. It's well attested in the Bible. Of course, if the tomb was not empty, it would be the easiest way
Hmm.
to unravel, all of the claims of early Christianity. And believe me, there are people that it was in their best interest. Those soldiers that were guarding
Clearly.
the tomb, Pontius
Right.
Pilate, Herod, the Sanhedrin, all of these people, it would have been in their best interest if they could say, actually, the tomb is not empty. That was a mistake. The women arrived at the wrong tomb. That would have been the easiest way to short circuit all of this. In the same way that if they could have produced a body, it would have been a great way, to short
Hmm.
circuit this. But basically, nobody disputes that the tomb was empty. They dispute what happened, to the
Right.
tomb. And
How did
this
it become
this
empty?
this is
Right.
where Habermas begins his argument. So let me give you six more things, and we can discuss them and how they kind of interface with some of the popular arguments against the resurrection. The first one of the next six is that Jesus died by crucifixion. This seems like kind of an obvious statement. You're like, why even include this in the argument? But it really makes a big impact. Everybody admits this is another one of the big facts of history that's well attested outside of the Bible that Jesus is crucified. But why would you put this in the argument?
Yeah, well, first of all, wrapped up in that is the historicity of Jesus, which is not in doubt. The accuracy, because this is going to be important. You're going to have to admit that the gospel accounts of Jesus' crucifixion are correct. He was indeed crucified. Roman sources say he was crucified. But now you're in the position of saying, but I'm going to reject another piece of it. So
Hmm.
the fact that he was crucified, he was certainly dead, it puts all of those kind of doubts to rest, and it validates a significant portion of what the Gospels have to say.
Yeah, one of the main theories against the resurrection, or I would say a couple of the theories, bank on the idea that Jesus wasn't truly dead.
Hmm.
So you have the swoon theory, which is that Jesus doesn't actually die, he goes into kind of a coma, and after he's been in this burial tomb for a couple of days, he comes back to life and is able to break out of the tomb. There are more sophisticated arguments under the swoon theory than that, but that's pretty much what they are. Is Jesus didn't
Right.
actually die, he comes back to life, he's rested up, and he's able to get out of the tomb, and then he shows himself to people, or he doesn't, depending on how you make that argument. And people proclaim that he rose from the dead. Jesus dying by crucifixion is one of the things that really makes that a hard thing to believe. The Romans were professional executioners, especially at this time in history. A lot of people being crucified, and shortly after as well, a lot of Christians being crucified. You go back and read that article that was in the American Medical Journal, kind of about the
Hmm.
the the anatomical and biological features of crucifixion. These people knew if somebody was dead or not. In fact, they had several mechanisms in place in the crucifixion to figure out if people were dead, to make sure they died. One of the unique details in the Gospels that's really interesting is that Jesus actually doesn't last as long on the cross
Right.
as the others. That's when they come to break their legs, they realize, oh, Jesus is already dead. That's when they plunge the spear into his side. A lot of people would stay on the cross for a day,
Right.
or 36 hours,
Hmm.
agonizingly clinging to life. And there's two things that are important about this. One, it's not like they were in a hurry and so they bungled it and thought Jesus was dead when he wasn't. He was the first one to die, they said. The second thing, though, is if you're writing these gospels and you're talking about Jesus being the Son of God, you're not going to make up the fact that he dies first.
Right.
No, especially in the ancient world, if you think about the Iliad or the Odyssey, none
Hmm.
of those valiant heroes die first in the battle. They
Right.
always make it longer than you think they're going to. They're tougher than they ever could have been. This is not a detail that you make up. All of these details point to the fact that he really was dead, and they knew he was dead. And when they came to prepare the body, they knew he was dead because he'd been crucified. It was one of the surest way to know that you were going to kill somebody in the ancient world was to crucify him.
Well, and even the earliest known objection to the resurrection was a rumor that began that the disciples had stolen the body.
Hmm.
But let me just pause there. We'll deal with that in a minute. But let me pause for a second. Even the people at the time didn't believe the swoon theory
Right,
because it
right.
made no sense. In other words, the best they could come up with is, well, they probably stole the body. It never occurred to them, oh, he probably wasn't actually dead. So I don't know that I've heard anybody reputable advancing that idea in quite some time.
Well, to your other point, the second thing that Habermas brings up is that Jesus' followers had experiences that they believe were the appearances of Christ. Now, notice this is subtle, but it's important. We're not arguing in this point, because again, we're going back to this what would everybody accept generally was true about Jesus' death and the empty tomb.
Hmm.
Well, you may not accept that Jesus actually did rise from the dead, but what almost nobody could argue against is that his disciples believed that he rose from the dead. They believed that they had had experiences with Jesus. And this is what Paul points to in 1 Corinthians 15. He says he appeared to Peter and the disciples. He appeared to 500 people. Probably that's Matthew 28, where the crowd comes and he ascends up to heaven.
Hmm.
And last of all, he appeared to me. So he's saying, you can go talk to people if you want to about the appearances. But what you can't really argue is that nobody thought that they had seen the risen Jesus.
Right. Agreed. That, I mean, that's definitive. There's no doubt that they thought that. And further, the third fact is you can't doubt that they were transformed by these experiences. Now, you might want to make an argument that they were mistaken, but pause for just a second. So they clearly had an experience where they believed that they had seen the risen Christ, and add to that a bunch of other witnesses. But everyone would also agree that it changed their lives. And that experience led almost all of them, probably all but one, to a violent death because they were preaching that. So, in other words, there
Right,
was no reinforcement. If they were lying, there was certainly no reinforcement or value to be lying. So they clearly were
right.
transformed.
Yes, absolutely. You have to think about how drastically some of their lives changed because of what they believed about Jesus rising from the dead. This was not a temporary let's pull the wool over everybody's eyes. This was a
Hmm.
radical transformation. And in Habermas's argument, he gets into the specifics of two of the ones that are actually the most eye-opening. What would it take for these two to be converted? You think about Peter, well, it would be convenient for Peter if Jesus had
Hmm.
risen from the dead. You could make that argument. But he goes on to mention James, who's the brother of Jesus. And of course, one of the points there is, what would your brother have to do to convince you that he was the
Right.
Son of God and rose from the dead? I mean, I personally speaking, nothing, would convince
Right.
me of that of my brothers, and probably the same from them to me. This is somebody who we know was skeptical of Jesus before
Hmm.
the resurrection. We have accounts in the Gospels of James and his family, including Mary, who are skeptical about Jesus's claims. And then after the resurrection, you have James leading the church in Jerusalem. In fact, he's martyred
Right.
for his faith. And so the proximity there is interesting. Here's somebody who had known Jesus for his whole life. After the resurrection, he's proclaiming that Jesus rose from the dead. You could say that he's wrong, but it would be very hard to argue with somebody like James that he is sincere.
Right. Agreed. And the second one, that's another unusual convert, is Saul or the Apostle Paul. I
Hmm.
mean, everything he says about himself, being up and comer in Judaism, persecuting the Jews, what would it take for him then to live the rest of his life being beaten and thrown out of towns and spreading the gospel, ended up being beheaded for preaching this? What would it take? Well, he says it took a vision of literally the resurrected Christ. I would challenge anybody to come up with something else that would do that, other than
Hmm.
that he clearly had something happen to him that he thought was the resurrected Christ, and it had this effect for the rest of his life.
Yeah, he's another guy where it's completely inconvenient. There's no you'd have a hard time thinking of a selfish motive for him to proclaim and spend his life teaching that Jesus had risen from the dead. In fact, it's much better for somebody like Paul if Jesus didn't rise from the dead.
Right.
So again, it's possible to say that he's wrong, but it's very difficult to doubt that he believed it. He never went back on it. He spent his life teaching it. He eventually was killed for it. Um, when you combine this with some of the ways that people have talked about this scientifically, it's just not a very plausible thing that this was a mass delusion that nobody ever uncovered. A lot of people thought they saw something, they all thought it consistently, they all agreed in a lot of the details. Either it's a conspiracy or it's a delusion. Either way, it becomes very difficult to say that all these people were consistent and for the rest of their life they believed it. and charge them with either malevolence or insincerity, like we've said. So what are the, this is where you get to the place in the argument where you say, you may not think resurrection is a very likely explanation, but given the facts that we have, the other explanations don't seem very likely either.
Yeah, one thing, Cole, I think we think is we think back in time and we think the people that were there at that time, well, since they lived a lot earlier than we did, they must be a lot dumber than we are.
Hmm.
And they must not be as analytical as we are. And that's not even slightly true. People at that time, there were just as many atheists then as there are now. There are just as
Hmm.
many people who found that hard to believe as there are today. And yet, here's eyewitness testimony that caused countless people to believe it on the basis of the eyewitnesses. And finally, the sixth thing that Habermas comes up with is this isn't something that got invented later. This is from the very beginning, the teaching of the church. In fact, if you go through the New Testament, it is at the center of the sermons, is
Hmm.
about the resurrection. I know it's not at the center of all of our sermons, but it is at the center of the sermons of the early church. And so
Right.
this belief is essential. It's not like, well, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in people rising from the dead, but I love that Sermon on the Mount. So I think I'll become a Christian. Well, you might say that today when there's potentially some social benefit to being a Christian. There's certainly no social uh, stigma to it in our time. But in those days, there was no social benefit to being a Christian. And in fact,
Right.
there was a great social stigma. So if you didn't believe the resurrection, you certainly weren't going to become a Christian because there was no other benefit to do so.
Right. Right. Yeah, you've got to think that people then operated under similar human nature as we do
Hmm.
now. They weren't dumb. They were smart. They were motivated by the same things that we're motivated. And so if you really put yourself in that situation, that's what undermines some of these arguments against the resurrection. It's just the plausibility of a person behaving that way. It just seems like it doesn't quite match. Like what does it take to start this kind of movement immediately where people are willing to give up everything they have, they're willing to die, they're willing to spend their lives in the service of somebody they believe was raised from the dead. That, a ruse or a delusion, just that just doesn't seem to have the force in terms of motivating behavior in the way that you would need for this to happen.
Yeah, I agree. Even the probably the biggest theory that I hear from skeptical academics is that Jesus was indeed crucified, he was indeed dead, and someone took his body from that tomb. And so his body was probably taken and buried somewhere else. Disciples come, find an empty tomb, and decide he must have been raised from the dead.
Hmm.
I get that. That's good as far as it goes. The problem is they didn't infer that he was raised from the dead just because the tomb was empty. Oh, a
Right.
mistaken assumption. No, it's based on eyewitness testimony that they saw him. Without that, you might have a good argument that someone stole the body. But
Right.
with the fact that 500 people saw him alive, the disciples all saw him, at that point, even that scenario doesn't stand.
Yeah. Yeah. A missing persons case doesn't, your immediate thought is not they've risen from the dead, right? I mean, nobody thinks that Jimmy Hoffa's risen from the dead just because they can't find, that was so unreasonable then, just like it would be now. That would not be your first instinct is the body's gone. He must have risen. Your instinct would
Right.
be the body's gone. Somebody stole the body.
Exactly.
Um,
That's what the women said. Has someone taken, remember, they come to the tomb and they said, has someone taken my Lord? Tell me where
right.
he is. That was their
Exactly.
first assumption as well.
Yeah, you're right to point out that once you move past the tomb was empty, what happened, the next thing you've got to deal with, and that's why I love this list that Habermas has made, is these people thought that they had seen Jesus. They didn't just think that he was gone. They thought that they had seen him. You've got to do something with the appearances to his followers. And that's where when you get to the end of this list, you have to say, you may not be willing to accept the resurrection, but do you have a better explanation?
Right.
Are you willing to just investigate? Are you willing to say, well, let's test a theory. Let's have a theory and see, what the facts will support and what it won't. I understand people that are agnostic about this, in the
Hmm.
sense that I don't know what happened. I don't know that he
Right.
rose from the dead, but I don't know what happened. It's hard for me to see any other theory really holding water when you lay it down next to the publicly available facts that pretty much everybody would agree to. And it opens the door to say, well, is the simplest explanation, or in logic we call it, is the inference to the best explanation that maybe Jesus did rise from the dead? Is that the best we can do?
I think anybody who's doubting their doubts, anybody who's willing to look into it has to at least admit the possibility. For 2,000 years, some of the smartest people in the world who had an awful lot of incentive to not want to believe in Christianity, and no one's ever come up with a better idea. And that,
Hmm.
to me, when I became a Christian, was telling, and it still is compelling to me today. This doesn't prove Christianity, but if you want to disprove Christianity, you're going to need to come up with something that fits the facts. And
Right.
nothing I've heard fits these facts, except, you know what? This guy was raised from the dead.
Yeah. One of the best resources on this is N.T. Wright's book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, which I know we both read. And
Hmm.
it's one that I go back to as a reference book quite a bit. It's thick and very detailed, but it's really, if you want to think about this in terms of the scholarship and kind of the best foot forward of a Christian who's making sense of the historical aspect of Jesus' resurrection, Wright is definitely the place to start. And I love it. Towards the end of that book, you've gone 700 pages into this book, and here's
Uh-huh.
what N.T. Wright says: historical argument alone cannot force anyone to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. But historical argument is remarkably good at clearing away the undergrowth behind which skepticisms of various sorts have been hiding. The proposal that Jesus was bodily raised from the dead possesses unrivaled power to explain the historical data at the heart of early Christianity.
Amen.